Okay, so from room one, who wants to share a couple of ideas and the questions you discussed? That's the group where was Angela and Annalise and Esther, Ingrid, Jamie, Kylie, and Megan. Prep. Well, you were not there, but usually.
All right, so for group one, and please everyone jump in. We started with some aha moments from Thursday's presentation and hearing other stories in navigating systems. And it's so important to hear voices of the impacts of navigating systems and how people see themselves and their success. And we left with the question, how do we work with communities that struggle most to navigate systems and find representation? Let's see. I can only, all right, let me see if all right, how's that? Can you hear me better?
Yes.
All right. And then thank you. I had to reselect English when I came back into the room under the translation. Then we looked at a dominant culture perspective and a conversation that Oregon is culturally, sometimes we think Oregon is culturally responsive, but we're not really there as a state. And sometimes rules or food programs, for example, sleeping practices, or needing a doctor's note for alternative food choices in a food program really push against best cultural practices. And sometimes exceptions that are culturally based are not always approved. And that requires a lot of extra energy, often further deprivileging or depleting of resources for family. And this continues to reinforce this belief that individuals are not seen or heard or represented. And then we look briefly at question 3 and the dismantling of structures and separating structures from people, because what we want are people in relationship, because a structure is not something, a structure is the people in there, and really looking at how do we recognize that systems are not people, and we need to work with people in relationship. And we need to look at relationship versus efficiencies, which are what like the university structure is about. And how do we find that balance of having both structures, because we can't, just like driving, you can't have no rules of the road. We need structural elements and relationships. And how do we have the opportunities to collaborate, and how do we look at definitions, because definitions belong to the definers, not those who are defined. And that was sort of a brief summary of our conversation. Please let me know, everyone in our group, if I missed any important points.
Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you very much. Well, those are the ideas you had there. Let's keep on with room number 2. It's the one with Amy, Cassandra, Katie, Leslie, Lynette, Alexis. Who wants to share?
Well, I can share one, and then the rest of my group can chime in. But for question number 3, which was addressed, it was a how question, and what do we stand to gain in this sort of shift from the dominant culture? And I thought in my reflection over the last 2 days that the organizers of this research roundtable have provided us with a model of how to do just that. And in that journey, sort of my story, is to put the intentional coordination of elevating Spanish language, fill in the blank, could be any other language for any other purpose or any other cultural group, by putting all of the participants in the shoes of those who have to navigate services and information and knowledge through interpretation. And what that feels like is a great knowledge builder, but it's also the creator of understanding and empathy and impact. And I think that our hats off to the organizers, the intentional organization of elevating that and the individual stories and the knowledge base. It's walking the walk. And I think that this is a great model that every participant can take with them in how they lift up the stories within their own communities, their own practices. I think that's what creates change. So this is a really bold move, and I hope we use it with legislative leaders, because I think we can address funding if we were to put them in that place so that they can understand this dynamic, because you can tell it all day and you can put it on a research paper, but to experience it as you do in stories is quite different. So thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Lots of clapping over here. And well, that was part of the idea. And I think we're really grateful to listening to your ideas. I don't know if anyone else wants to add something from that group, or we can move on to room number 3. Heather, James, Nancy, Veronica.
If no one is adding anything more, I can go from group 3 and want to thank my group, Veronica, Jasmine, Nancy, and then Heather, who filled out the form for us. I guess I did the very analytical dominant culture thing. It's like, well, let's just go through them one by one. But we did spend much of our time on that first question of how to define quality, basically, when working with the diverse cultures. And it is a big question, because you have both the sort of the educational requirements, but then that cultural experience. And as was pointed out, some of our speakers addressed that, and it's like you have to do both. We right now, it's sort of a low bar. It's like, let's just make sure all the materials are out in the appropriate languages, and we're not doing that. If we're going to be diverse in our cultural representations, it's got to be diverse in meals, and I think Ingrid already talked about that in the first group. And we also, so quality is going to have different definitions, but it's not a separate but equal thing. We're applying both in all these cases. And so we didn't have a ton of conversation about the research questions, but when it does come to the research and how it's either we're dealing with the single dominant narrative, the dominant culture, or the context of culture and complexity, though, it's again, as it was talked about by our speakers, you've got to take time to develop the relationships. You can't expect it to rush. We want people to feel comfortable. I think it was Veronica was pointing out that if you're doing a survey, the temptation is to be as brief as possible. But if you're allowing people to speak, and I think the term was, feel like they're in their mom's kitchen, they're going to give a broader narrative. They're going to tell a richer story, and you're going to get more of the information that you need. And it's possible, to gently redirect as needed, but you want people to feel comfortable telling their story, and that's where the better research is done. And it takes time, and it takes building relationships. So finally, what are some of these challenges that people face? Well, people are afraid of saying the wrong thing. And so we have to, and this is something I brought up, that with ODHS, we did a survey recently internally to our districts, how are relations with your tribal partners? And it's mixed, but there was open-ended questions, and some of the people were saying, we're simply uncomfortable because we're afraid we're going to say the wrong thing, or, and there's a history of broken promises. And so that's something that we're recognizing and working with our tribal office to develop a toolkit. And it sounds like it's something that I think happens all over the state and not just within ODHS, although we have those problems. So that's a real quick run through in our conversation. I know I left out some important things. If anyone wants to add anything, please feel free.
Thank you, James. Really, really insightful, right? Thinking it from that perspective and the issue of quality as well. Let's move to room number 4 with Ruby, Jenny, Alexis, Nella.
Yes, I will be sharing briefly. I know we're quick on time right now. So we kind of started addressing question 4. So how do we understand the intersection between research and equity in a context of cultural complexity? What a question. We answered it. We solved the problem. We're ready to go. And so what we really did kind of take a step back from the question a little bit to think about what are the barriers in the systemic system and systematic barriers we have. We had Nelda shared she said a thing that I now will forever remember, that we have to own our ignorance, that we don't know it all. We cannot be culturally responsive by translating a document. We have to consider these big picture factors. We also kind of had a discussion that Ruby initiated around funding. While we want to so much believe that the field is beyond zeros and ones and effect sizes and things, it's not, because it's tied to funding. And how do we shift big picture changes starting at the top? Because we need more representation in the field, but there's barriers to that. We need transparency, but there's barriers, because without funding, we can't do practice. And so I will move. There you go. It was big, it was mighty, and it tied into really all those other questions of, we want to do good work. A lot of us feel that in our heart work, but how do we get the zeros and ones to matter beyond a 0 and 1?
Thank you very much. It's already 11:45, so we know we had a schedule. So if anyone needs to leave now, we have the document there. It's all your thoughts are there for everyone to share, and you can also add anything if you want, or you can come back later and see what the rest of the teams are sharing. So if you need to go, please do it. And well, thank you very much for your participation, for your active and sensitive participation in these two days. And well, if you have a few more minutes, let's continue with the rest of the rooms. Okay, so thank you, and then we'll go to room number 5.
Our group talked about many of the other things, really understanding the definition of quality and helping teachers to understand the variety of needs, and to be able to communicate with families and understand their needs, and understand that if there's a disconnect between the child and the child care, then the issue might not be the child. So focusing on that, also really building trust with community. We're not going to be able to bring those stories in and to hear those stories to be able to shift the system unless we really hold space for that, and also build the trust for that. And that it needs to be more than just inclusion, but a real shift to supporting researchers within community to hear the voices in their own community. And I will see if anybody else in the group has anything to add to what we talked about. We also talked about pushing back against the systems. There was reference to the discussion about the IRB and how you work from within the system to push back and make sure that the system itself is reflecting what you're trying to do in the community.
All right, thank you, Sydney. I think it's from room number 6. We have Dina, are you there?
I am, and there was Catherine and Ronnie as well. I don't know if they're still here.
I think they left. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, just to be real brief, we talked quite a bit about the sort of structural limitations of the timelines that we often face for a particular project or report. And, I really got me to thinking about some specific examples in the last couple of years, reaching out to community partners to really slow down and take the time to consult with the community we're working with, and the times in which our timeline didn't fit with their ability to work with us, and the folks that we didn't get to talk to or include or learn from because, we had a 2-month window. Or, and so we were just talking quite a bit about, the larger structural changes around the timeline of a grant, being limited to 24 months or whatever it might be, may take some time, but what we can realistically set out when we're applying for funding about really creating space and time to slow down and talk and build relationships and develop trust. We're just talking about what we can do right now and what might, take a longer time to get to, but needs to be on our minds as well.
Thank you very much. And then we'll have our final room. It was room number 7. Who wants to share a bit of what you discussed?
I'll present for a room who had Ashley, Michaela, Jenny, Sarah, and me. We really did a pretty deep dive into question number 3 about trying to escape that single dominant narrative. And we really started by talking about the composition of the room, like who's just simply there, which wandered into the space of, well, it's not just about bringing people in, but once we do bring them in, are we ensuring that they're safe there, that their voices are actually going to be heard there, that they're not going to be harmed? And then reaching beyond, how do we bring people into research, but what about bringing people into the actual learning spaces, bringing their stories into these spaces? And a very similar conversation then started to arrive, right, of a non-academic agenda of telling these stories, and what to do when the contexts are either sometimes very welcoming or all the way to hostile. Those are very different ways to bring in stories. What if it's just one Native child in that classroom in a hostile space? How do you bring in those stories, right, safely? And then we started talking a bit more about policy and specific cultural practices. Like we brought up spotting as well. I think sleep was all on our minds somehow. And then also some of those larger solutions that are happening, kind of going back up again in those institutional spaces around time-intensive, meaningful trainings that can really help shift some perspective of people that currently do hold the power. Yeah, we kind of brought it all the way around.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, there's time is very limited, but I just wanted to thank all of you for attending, for participating, for sharing these deep insights, and also for opening to these sensitive issues. And let's just remember that even though we're here for early education, these are things that are transversal, right? They go all through our experiences in education and beyond. So thank you. It was really a pleasure to know you all and to be part of this effort. And thank you very much, Megan.
Thank you, everybody, so much. This has been such an amazing experience to navigate, and you all were supposed to be here. And so I appreciate it, and I'm energized and hope you all are too. And that this gives me, I was in a talk recently, I know we're done, but and someone was talking about, you have to have that utopian hope out there of change to keep going. And this has been like a dose of that for me. And so I really appreciate everyone that has put themselves out there to speak out in the last 2 days and share your stories. And yeah, thank you. Have a great rest of your day and look forward to more conversations with all of you.